Hey everybody, I'm thinking a lot about where I'm going to go with my video series next. So I want to talk a little bit about positive communication. And for the purposes of this, actually, I'm going to set the athletes aside for a second, and we're going to do a little bit of work with both coaches and parents. Um, and this is an interesting topic for me, again, at the outset, just sort of doing an intro. um, when I started my coaching career, I was a college coach. So I had almost no interaction with parents, especially in that time. It was 2007. And to the extent that a parent had any significant communication with me, was usually around coordinating some kind of um, activity around something we were doing. It was very sort of functional, or just like, hey, nice socialization. Nope. If anybody contacted me with like a concern, I can remember coaching at Georgia Tech and having a parent contact me about what was going on with their kid. And at that time in my career, I was just able to pull a kid in the office and be like, why am I talking to, your mom about this? So it was a really big shock to my system when I went over to Denmark and I became a club coach, and all of a sudden I was having a lot of interaction with parents. And in fact, so much interaction that, like, for instance, there were a lot of meets, there was no spectator area for parents. So parents of kids that I was coaching were literally standing next to me while I watched their kids swim. So you can imagine, in some ways, that is a tough environment. And I didn't always handle it that great. So part of what I'd like to do is speak from that experience, talk about some things that worked well in terms of positively communicating with parents, um, and also talk about some mistakes that I made along the way, and hopefully you can learn from them as I work through those. I should say, once I finish that part of it, I am also going to start talking about how to communicate the other way, because I'm not only a coach, but I'm a parent. Now I have a young kid, right? I've got two kids, but one of them is, really like um, just beginning to be in an environment where I might communicate uh, about important stuff with the teacher. So I've got a daughter who's in kindergarten, and just sort of starting to have some conversations around what's going on there. And I want to speak to it from the perspective of um, being on the other side of it, being a parent, and sending your kid off to things has given me a lot of empathy for the parents I've dealt with. There's been a lot of situations that I look back on where I realize much better where people were coming from, why people were um, so worked up. And the thing that I want to do to frame this whole conversation around communication is um, a term that it's not mine, but I've borrowed, and that is gracious assumption. And I think whenever you're doing these communications one way or another, I think you need to start with a gracious assumption. And my gracious assumption um, as a coach looking at parents of kids that I'm coaching is that the parents want absolutely um, the best for their kids, and they want their kids to be happy. Okay, and if you start with that assumption instead of ascribing any other motives to the behaviors that they do, I think that's a really good starting point. I think on the flip side, um, if you're a parent looking at a teacher or a coach, you should assume that that person got into the profession because they love working with kids and really want to teach and help your kids to grow and learn. And if you can start with those assumptions, I think there's a lot of good that can come from it. Doesn't mean that there won't be bad coaches, doesn't mean that there won't be bad parents on the other side, that really give you a hard time or act out of line, or do things behavior-wise that are totally out. But if you can set aside the motivation part of it, and then on the other side, we can start to talk about a list of behaviors that are, I think, best practices. So look forward to that. On the front end, I'll talk a little bit about some topics, as I said, with coaches communicating with parents. See you soon.